Welcome back to Tour With Us on Tuesdays here at the Onslow County Museum. For the last several weeks, we've been taking a virtual tour of our signature exhibit, The Water and the Wood. Now, one of our key talking points throughout this exhibit has been to really talk about what you, our audience, had questions about. And one of the things we hear so frequently is, so what did we grow here in Onslow County? What were our crops? Well, certainly, and what we learned back in our antebellum portion of the tour is we talked a lot about the navel stores industry. Here's to the land of the longleaf pine, for sure. But after the American Civil War, the demand for that tar, pitch, and turpentine decreased, and Onslow County had the appearance of a new crop. This crop was tobacco. Tobacco would transform the landscape. It would transform the economy, and it would give birth to a new economic tradition here in the South known as sharecropping. Who among us has not heard about sharecropping or maybe seen it in movies about the 1920s or even conversations with our very own grandparents? But sharecropping would be that tradition whereupon people could not own their own land, but would in fact farm the land of others and share the crop, giving half of what they would earn to the landowner. We learned a lot about sharecropping here at the museum just by conducting oral history interviews. We talked to a lot of folks who farmed here, who for the first time introduced tobacco to their family farms, and that really has played a part in their family traditions from the turn of the century well into the late 20th century. Today it's pretty rare to see tobacco growing, and we all certainly know that tobacco consumption is incredibly dangerous and detrimental to our health. But 100 years ago, 150 years ago, it would transform who we would be here in Onslow County. Not only economically, not only socially, but it would give a whole new rise to different vocabulary, to different ways of socializing. And here at the museum, we preserved those artifacts that tell the story of those families that worked on those tobacco farms. So certainly agriculture was a big part of what happened here in that post-Civil War era. It would try and help bring us out of that economic downturn that happened in the years of Reconstruction. But there were also some other big changes. Take a minute as we go around the water and the wood and find one of the biggest changes, not just to our landscape, but to transportation, bringing the world to Onslow County. How many of us can remember when the railroad tracks actually ran through Onslow County? By the 1980s, rail transportation was entirely gone from this area. But from the 1890s through the 1970s, this was a great way to get from here to there. So how did the railroad come here and why so late? Well, the railroad was actually brought here by Thomas McIntyre. For those of us who've ever been to visit the Biltmore in the Vanderbilt estate in Asheville, we learn a lot about the idea of what's called a robber baron in the era of the Gilded Age. Well, Onslow County had our very own robber baron. And Thomas McIntyre came to us from New York and Baltimore. He worked in the flour business, not F-L-O-W-E-R, but F-L-O-U-R. The flour business. He was also worked in stocks and bonds. And he came here to this place and purchased 4,000 acres. On that 4,000 acres, he built an enormous estate, more than 30 rooms, this kind of beautiful arts and crafts era home that he built overlooking the New River. And in order to ease his own personal transportation, he brought a rail line here. That rail line would grow to what we eventually would know as the Atlantic Coastline Railroad that ran parallel to Highway 17. So certainly A huge, huge change to our age of transportation and that turn of the 20th century was the railroad. The other thing was the lumber industry. We mentioned before that the era of tar, pitch and turpentine and naval stores was on the decline, but that did not mean that Onslow County, eastern North Carolina, was still not covered with stands and stands of timber. But it would change in what it would supply. No longer was it the sap that was inside the tree, but now we wanted the wood itself. The wood for a growing community. We will see how this influences not only the economy, but the very way that we build our houses. When we have these new sawmills, we can now have these beautiful Victorian homes that appear in places like Swansboro and downtown Jacksonville and downtown Richlands, because we have those sawn timbers to create new ways of construction. You know, what I like to think about when we visit the museum and we think about these changing economies and changing societal views and right down to the way that we build our houses are all things that are interconnected. There is not one standalone story, but many stories that connect one to the other. When next we visit Tour With Us Tuesdays, we're going to learn what happens in the 1920s and 30s and how Onslow County will eventually boom again. Thanks as always for seeing us here for Tour With Us Tuesdays.